Season 9 is a really underrated season, but how does it compare to the classics? There are some excellent episodes in this season, but there are also some terrible ones. Let's review them one by one. Before we start the ranking, I just want to warn you all that there's a very controversial opinion on a certain episode that I have, so be prepared. Unlike Season 8, Season 9 started off on a really strong note. Percy the Oil Painting is a really good episode. It uses the Three Strikes formula really well, and Percy is 100% in character. I don't have much to say about this episode, as a certain YouTuber already made a video about it, linked in the description. Overall, this episode is fantastic, and one of my favorites in this season. Thomas and the Rainbow is a slight step down in quality. Thomas is an idiot, the crash is very lightweight, and the ending is so cheesy. This episode goes into the poor tier. Thomas's milkshake model isn't much better. Thomas is again an idiot. Emily is a bitch. The story is boring, and the events that play out are so dumb. I do like, though, that this episode teaches kids how to turn milk into butter, which is why I'm putting this above Thomas and the Rainbow. Mighty Mac is an improvement. Mighty Mac themselves have a really cool design, and this episode showcases some of the potential that they have. The landslide is really cool, and I like how the ending is handled. Mr. Percival doesn't show up out of nowhere and tell Mighty Mac that they caused confusion and delay. Instead, the passengers work together to lift the coach onto the track, and that inspires Mighty Mac to work together to push the rocks out of the way. My only gripe with this episode is that Thomas is used to introduce Mighty Mac. But hey, at least he only appears at the beginning of the episode and never appears again throughout the episode. This episode goes in the favorites tier. Molly's Special isn't as good, but I feel like it had some potential. Molly is a decent character that I think has potential to become a STEAM team member. I just wish she wasn't introduced alongside Thomas and that James was in Emily's role. Imagine how fun this episode would be if James and Molly were paired up in a rivalry story. Not much to say, so this episode goes in the good tier. Respect for Gordon has a really nice ending, but to me, that's it. I'm sorry, but I've rewatched it for like the second time in my life, and while it wasn't as bad as when I first watched it, I still can't bring myself to like it. The moral is a bit bog standard, and the crash is really bad. Not only am I still traumatized from when I first saw it, but it is also quite dumb. I mean, what were those tankers doing on the main line? Why were they even uncoupled? Who was pulling them? I also find Emily to be way too mean here, and the firebox thing is so dumb. I'm putting this episode straight into the bad tier. Sorry, guys. Thomas and the Birthday Picnic is the first episode written by the infamous Sharon Miller. It's nothing special, it's kind of boring and uninteresting. This goes in the okay tier. Tuneful Toots is also written by her, and it is much worse. Rusty is so irresponsible, the other engines suddenly hate on his horn for no reason, and his horn does get annoying after a while. This episode goes between Thomas's episodes in the poor tier. Thomas in the Toy Shop is an episode that I adored as a kid, and now I still quite like it. I don't love it, it's not the best of the season, but it had all the potential to be a terrible, boring Three Strikes Thomas episode, and instead it was a decent Thomas and Henry story. Henry himself is very much in character, and while the Toy Factory is quite gimmicky, Thomas's dynamic with Henry outweighs that gimmickiness. This episode goes above Molly's Special and great. Rheneas and the Dinosaur is a bad episode. Rheneas and Skarloey being written as children starts here, and the story is just a boring episode about friendship. Rheneas' theme and the dinosaur skeletons are nice though, but that can't save it from me putting it below Respect for Gordon. Thomas and the New Engine is an episode that was hated by the fandom for very ridiculous reasons, but has recently been receiving some love by certain fans, and I agree with those that enjoy it. In my top 10 worst classic Thomas episodes video, I used this episode to compare it to Thomas and the Rumors, and I still stand by what I said in that video. The way the Rumors were handled is amazing, Thomas is perfectly flawed, and Neville's crash is amazing. I'm not doing an in-depth analysis on this episode as a certain YouTuber who I've mentioned quite a lot already did so. Seriously, please subscribe to the Yellow Striker. If you haven't already, you are causing confusion and delay and deserve to be banished to the Shadow Realm. This episode goes in the favorites tier. It definitely deserves more love. I wish I could say the same about Toby Feels Left Out, but I just can't. Toby thinking that the Fat Controller would put him in a museum is so out of character, and the story is really boring. The moral is forgettable, the crash is so dumb, and the title is laughable. It might be my new least favorite episode of Season 9. Thomas Tries His Best is a decent episode. It has a really nice moral, and Thomas is actually tolerable for once. I like how he thinks about the consequences of his actions before he does them, and the ending doesn't feel forced. This episode goes into the bottom of the favorites for me. Now, let's talk about The Magic Lamp. The Magic Lamp is my favorite episode of Season 9. Yes, I know it's a 3 Strikes episode, but I also don't care. What I do like is everything else. Peter Sam being resentful of Legend is a very interesting character trait. I've seen some people say that Duncan would be better suited for this role, but honestly, I think that would just make the episode worse. We already had an episode in Season 5 where Duncan scoffs at Rusty's story, and if we saw him do it again, it would kinda regress his character, just like in Trusty Rusty. Thus, I find it more funny seeing those fireflies scare Duncan to the point where he now believes in any superstition. Thus, the atmosphere is really good. Skarloey telling the legend of Proteus is in character, and Proteus' legend not being said to be true or not is a nice touch. Certainly Miller's best episode by far, and goes at the top of the favorites tier. Thomas and the statue is honestly just as good. The engines of Sodor are really at each other's throats in this season, and this is one of the few episodes to use the 2 flawed protagonist trope. The Yellow Striker already covered this episode in his 10 Hidden Gems of the Hit Era video, so I'd recommend you go and watch that if you want my full opinion on this episode. Link is in the description. Overall, this episode goes in the favorites tier. Henry and the Flagpole is another episode with absolutely ridiculous criticism, but before we talk about that, let's go into why I like this episode. I like how Henry's love for nature is still around, and the fact that he tries to save a tree from being cut down is really nice. Okay, now onto the criticism. Some have complained that Sir Topham Hatt blames Henry for knocking over the flagpole at Brendam Docks, and those who think that have clearly never watched the episode, because Sir Topham Hatt didn't blame Henry for the incident. Henry blamed himself for the incident. Have you guys even watched this episode fully? Because last time I checked, all Sir Topham Hatt said was,
"This is a disaster. The Scottish castle will not look the same without its flagpole."
The only time he told Henry off was at the sheds, and it was because Henry was dawdling about when he should be taking the workmen to the forest. Some people have also complained that Henry should know better than to think that the Fat Controller would cut down a tall pine tree. Well, how would you feel if one of your friends was talking about your favorite tree getting cut down, only for you to wake up and notice workmen with axes and saws? Pretty upset, I think. I mean, what else is Henry supposed to think when he sees this? Overall, this episode is overhated and goes in the great tier. Emily Knows Best is an underrated gem. I love the idea of Emily wanting to be a queen, and seeing her and Toby arguing is really interesting. Speaking of Toby, he's perfectly in character and that crash is epic. This episode goes in the greats. Another Sharon Miller contribution that was really good is Thomas's Day Off. Dennis has a really unique design and a really interesting character. I just wish that he was paired up with Daisy instead of Thomas, since she was very similar to Dennis in Season 2. Sure, the idea of an engine having a day off is dumb, but so is Gordon being able to roll into a ditch on his own record. This episode goes in the favorites. Thomas's new trucks is definitely one of the weaker episodes this season. Thomas and James getting new trucks is so dumb. and them worrying about them being clean makes it even worse. The crash sucks as well. This episode overall is bland, fillery, and rides the line between poor and bad. Duncan and the Old Mine is my third favorite episode this season. Duncan and Rusty's dynamic is back, and I like how it doesn't fall into the cliche Rusty is right and Duncan is wrong trope. This is another episode that the Yellow Striker covered in his 10 Hidden Gems video, so I'd highly recommend you go and check that out. This episode overall rocks. Bold and Brave is another underrated episode. The idea of the curse and cliffs is really interesting. The idea of the curse on the cliffs is really interesting, and it was nice seeing Ben have a solo role, although I do wish Molly had Thomas's role, as she's never met Diesel before. This episode goes in the great tier. Skarloey the Brave is another childish Skarloey story, but I actually find it okay. Why? Because unlike Rheneas and the Dinosaur, it actually gave us an enjoyable runaway scene. However, the score sucks, and Skarloey is again childish here. This episode goes in the okay tier. Saving Edward is an episode that the Yellow Striker cherishes very fondly, but I can't do the same if I'm honest. Sorry mate, you're a great guy, but we can't agree on everything. Anyway, I feel Edward would know by now that the Fat Controller would never scrap him after all his years on the railway, and unlike Edward the Grey, where he pressed on despite how far Spencer is, he just gives up and whines about the fact that he's not a useful engine anymore. But Thomas caring for him saves this episode from going anywhere near the bad tier, so this goes in the okay one. Thomas and the Golden Eagle is mediocre. Unlike Thomas tries his best, Thomas does his actions before he thinks about the consequences of them, and the Golden Eagle thing makes this episode gimmicky. The ending was nice though, which saves it from being bad, but it's overall nothing to write home about. Keeping Up with James is also nothing to write home about, but it is a fun Edward and James story. It's almost Old Iron-esque in a way, nowhere near as good though. Some people have complained that Edward is out of character, which I disagree. If this was the same Edward that we saw in Saving Edward, then he would be whining about how he isn't as good as James and would need encouragement from another engine. But no, instead he does things his way when he's not in James's train, and even tells James off when he's being careless. Also, the score slaps. Overall, this episode is nothing to write home about, but it's fun and has a nice pairing, and goes in the good tier. And our final episode, Flower Power, is really good. The nighttime atmosphere is really nice, and the fact Thomas isn't outwardly scared and is instead mostly annoyed with Diesel makes it better. The story isn't entirely scary, but unlike Halloween, they do leave some things unexplained until the last second. And I can see some kids being scared by this episode when they first see it. The music is also pretty intense, and thus goes in the good tier. After that ranking, I've decided that Season 9 is an improvement over Season 8. The sets overall are better looking than Season 8, and the amount of strong crashes this season is amazing. There was a lot of conflict between the engines, and this season did a really good job on doing things that Season 8 didn't, such as bringing back the narrow gauge engines and introducing newer characters. What do I think of them this season? Well, Skarloey and Rheneas are literal children, which is very disgraceful. Rusty is rather hit or miss, and Peter, Sam, and Duncan are the only two that are actually close to their classic portrayals. As for the new characters, they weren't expanded on at all, and I don't like how Thomas is used to introduce them, but otherwise are decent. Overall, Season 9 is a step up from Season 8, and thus goes above it in the ranking department. And that's Season 9. Next month I'll be reviewing Season 10, and I'm sure those who have seen my Which Way Now video know that I love that season, so I can't wait to make it. So stay tuned and goodbye.